In this lecture, we'll focus on how to tell a story, including different types of narrative structures and conventions, as well as principles for good storytelling. So I'll start with this quote. And it goes, "And maybe stories are just data with a soul." And this quote is by Brené Brown, and this is from her now famous TEDx talk called The Power of Vulnerability. And there's a lot of truth to this quote, and that stories can be just data that are brought to life, or in other words, have a soul. So when we think about storytelling in the context of the HR Analytics Project lifecycle or the Human Resource Analytics Project lifecycle, we can think about the connection between data interpretation and storytelling and question formulation. And what I mean by this is that our questions and the problems we identify, define, and formulate should really drive how we tell our stories. And so we'll return to this theme throughout the talk today. So as far as an outline or structure for this lecture goes, first we'll start with an overview of what a story is and what storytelling is, and we'll even talk about what strategic storytelling is. Then we'll move on to different types of storytelling structures or narrative structures and arcs, and then we'll focus on where to begin within that structure, as well as on the audience and context, the importance of clarity and parsimony when it comes to storytelling, and then finally some final considerations. So let's start with an overview. So a story is an account of a connected succession of events that is intended to instruct, inform, spur interest, and/or entertain. Storytelling, on the other hand, is the process of communicating a story to oneself or to others, or in other words, communicating to a broader audience. Now, stories can be told using any mode of communication, and this includes written words, spoken words, imagery, body language, and even music or physical performance like dance. So in terms of the role of storytelling, storytelling can operate as a sense-making tool and/or as an explanatory tool for the storyteller, others, or the organization if we're focusing on it within an organizational context. And so this means that people can use a story to make sense of their environment, of events that occur, as well as to try to explain those things as well. Now, I'll give you an example of how people tend to be predisposed to tell stories or craft stories, even if it's just to themselves. So in the literature on jury decision making, there's this idea that's called the storytelling model, or the story model for short. And specifically, the story model states that jurors construct verbal narratives and mental representations of trial-related events, and jurors' life events and perceptions help to shape the stories that they construct. And so jurors will do this even without being told to do so. So in general, people do have this natural tendency, and evidence pertaining to the story model supports this. When we think about specifically within the juror context or within juries in a legal system, that when people are presented with evidence, they tend to piece together those pieces of evidence into a story that can help make sense of the evidence and maybe even provide some explanation if we're thinking about storytelling as an explanatory tool. So this really demonstrates in part that humans have a tendency to construct stories even when they're not instructed to do so. Now, storytelling can also be used for shared learning and knowledge acquisition. So we can use deliberate storytelling in order to help people acquire new knowledge and hopefully to take action based off that knowledge if that's the goal, as well as to inspire shared learning. So let's talk now about a more specific type of storytelling that often is important within organizations, which is called strategic storytelling. And so with strategic storytelling, I think it's best showcased and illustrated by this quote by Seth Kahan, who's an organizational performance consultant. And this quote is pulled by Denning's publication from 2006 on page 47. And the quote is as follows: "In my work at NASA, I coach leaders on how to tell stories that accelerate positive change. The first thing these leaders needed to realize is that their primary goal is to make change happen, not to be seen as a good storyteller. It's immaterial whether or not listeners are aware that a story is being told, much less that they admire the story. However, the listener's reactions in response to this story are critical. We are looking for changes in behavior that align with the leader's objectives. When that happens, you have a powerful change agent equipped with a powerful tool." And so what I really like about this quote here is that strategic storytelling is about accelerating positive change and just simply making change within an organization. And I like that Seth Kahan points out here that the primary goal is to make that change happen and not to be seen necessarily as a good storyteller. Although that can help, the real goal is to inspire change here. And we want to focus on how people are going to react to the story that we're telling, as that's going to affect whether or not they make those changes that we're advocating for or suggesting within the context of our story. So strategic storytelling is all about this idea, trying to move people positively in a change direction towards things that are important for the organization, such as strategic objectives, goals, and in general, the organization's mission and core values. So let's now dive a little bit deeper into storytelling, and let's talk about different types of storytelling structures, at least conventional ones. So when I say structure, I mean the manner in which a story unfolds, including key parts or components of that story. So one important part of structure, and one important piece of structure within many stories is tension. Okay? And why is tension so important in many stories? Well, that is because tension in need of resolution is key to effective storytelling because it creates something, a build of energy that then needs to be released. And so you'll see this reflected in some of the subsequent types of structures that I present, which in this case will be the linear structure, Freytag's dramatic structure, and the mountain structure. And I'll show how these are all more or less related to each other and how you can use tension, especially within Freytag's dramatic structure and the mountain structure, to help build to a climax and then have some kind of resolution that follows that climax of energy that you've built up via that tension. So let's start with a very simple linear structure. A simple linear structure for a story can be thought of as this. You have a beginning, that leads to a middle, that leads to an end. Now within this though, we can use tension in our storytelling to try to create some kind of momentum in the story and again, kind of pent up that energy that needs to be released and hopefully brings in that audience attention, those people we're telling the story to. So this is all part of what's called a narrative arc. So now let's focus on Freytag's dramatic structure, which is a very famous type of storytelling structure. And when we're done with talking about it, I think you'll see very clearly as I'll articulate how it relates to some very classic pieces of literature you may already be familiar with. So Freytag's dramatic structure has a beginning, middle, and end, and it relies on tension as a feature of its structure. Now, the idea is with Freytag's dramatic structures, you start with some kind of exposition that explains the setting, the context, and so forth, and helps build the foundation for the story. And then you have this rise in action that takes place as you start building and building tension towards a climax. And then ultimately, you're going to see falling action. And so this is where the action, you start to see some resolution and some solutions, in other words, to the problems that someone or something or some organization faces during that rising action phase of this story. And then ultimately you have what they refer to in this context as the release of that tension. And that's at the end when you come to a full resolution or a full ending to the story. Okay, sometimes this is referred to as the hero's journey or the monomyth. And part of the reason for this is because if you think about classic pieces of literature like the Iliad or the Odyssey, you have first, as you have the rising action and the exposition phase, you have the hero leaving home for an adventure. And then as part of the climax, you have some kind of battle or crisis that hero faces. And then as the hero is finishing up their journey, they return home victorious. And this is part of that falling action and release that we see at the end of the story or towards the end of the story structure here. So now let's look at a very closely related structure, which is called the mountain structure, which is almost just a reconceptualization of Freytag's structure, using some slightly different terminology for the different phases of the story. So instead of exposition, we talk about the plot in the mountain structure. And so again, this is where you're really setting the stage in terms of context and needed background information that the listeners to the story or the audience to the story need to be aware of or know about. Just like the Freytag's dramatic structure, you have rising action within the mountain structure that leads to some kind of climax. And you'll also have that release of the tension in the form of falling action that leads to some kind of ending. Okay, and so that ending is where the release is, or the resolution at the end of the story. Now, as you can see, we still have the same storytelling structures in place and elements such as the beginning, the middle, and the end, as well as tension. And again, tension builds towards that climax via the rising action, and then it's released through the falling action all the way to the end of the story as we find some closure. So again, this is the narrative arc, and as I talked about before, this is this rising and falling action and the tension that we talk about within a storytelling structure. So let's talk now about how this mountain structure fits into what we would think of as classic problem solving, where if we're thinking about solving a problem, or rather what a problem is to begin with, we can think of a problem being the gap between the current state of affairs and a desired state of affairs. So how does that fit into this mountain structure? Well, really with the plot and the rising action phase, this is where we're trying to articulate what is the current state of affairs that we are facing in the context of this story. And then ultimately, through that climax and that tension we're building through that rising action, we're articulating what the desired state of affairs is. What is it that needs to happen? And so between these, we'll see this gap, and this is where our problem emerges. Okay? So we find this gap between the current state of affairs and the desired state of affairs, and by definition, that is a problem. And so now what this is setting us up for is how do we solve that problem? And so this is where the solution comes into play here. And so this is where typically during that climax phase and the falling action, you're starting to articulate what a potential solution or multiple solutions might be for that potential problem. And then that ultimately leads to an ending or a call to action. So with problem solving, if we're thinking about storytelling that's aimed at problem solving, we're really trying to steer towards this end of a call to action where we're trying to inspire change in the audience. We want people to perform certain actions after hearing the story that we're telling. So let's think about this mountain structure, and let's think about it with a specific example. And this is a specific human resource management story. And this is going to be somewhat generic in nature, but hopefully it brings to life how you can weave in these storytelling structure components into the mountain structure to tell a compelling story that helps to say what the problem is and how we can solve that problem. And then also more specifically, if there's any questions specifically related to that problem that we can try to answer and articulate via a compelling storytelling structure with tension that's building. So again, we're starting with the foundation of the mountain structure that I talked about previously. And so let's use this example right here. So let's say as far as the plot goes, here's the setting. We have an annual employee survey. Annual employee survey data indicated previously that engagement was at an all-time high in this organization. But then a global pandemic forced most employees to work remotely. Okay, so that's the important background information as part of the plot. Now, as part of the rising action, let's say that these administered weekly pulse surveys by the organization's HR team that were intended to track engagement levels showed that average engagement levels were actually trending downward across those weeks in which these pulse surveys intended to track engagement levels were actually administered. Okay, so this is the rising action and the building tension here. We're seeing that there's a problem here building, that engagement seems to be going down, and it might be related to issues directly related to this global pandemic and or specifically related to working remotely, perhaps for the first time, or working remotely to a greater extent than previously. And then ultimately we arrive at the climax. And let's imagine here that engagement levels reached an all-time low in the organization, whereas remember when the plot we were setting up that they had previously been at an all-time high. And not only did engagement levels reach an all-time low, but job performance started to drop as well along with those engagement levels. And so what we see here is that we need some change here. There needs to be a new desired state of affairs, which is we need to return to engagement and performance levels that were consistent with pre-pandemic levels at the very least. And then ultimately after that tension that's built towards the climax, this climax, this is where we start getting into that falling action as we start looking for resolutions, finding information, using information or data to help us understand how we can solve that problem regarding engagement levels dropping as well as performance. And so here, let's imagine that data analysis shows that units within this organization with higher perceived supervisor support had higher engagement and performance levels. So that gave us some ideas here in terms of, well, maybe the mechanism or the lever we need to pull here is that perceived supervisor support, and how can we change that within all units in the organization to improve engagement and performance levels, even as people are working remotely or away from the office and the organization physical location due to the global pandemic. And then ultimately, we end up at the ending or the release here, or the resolution phase, which is that the organization, let's say specifically the HR team, their call to action is that we need to invest in a training program designed to teach supervisors how to provide two important forms of supervisor support, which are emotional support and instrumental support, and how to do so virtually when people are working remotely. So in terms of layering on that problem-solving perspective to storytelling, here's where we're seeing this. So in terms of, as I was articulating before, we have this current state of affairs, which is that we had the highest levels of engagement this organization had ever seen, but then the pandemic and remote work seemed to lead to this decline week by week of engagement levels. And ultimately, we determined that we need to bring those engagement levels as well as performance that seemed to be going down in tandem with those engagement levels. We need to bring those back to pre-pandemic levels. And so the problem we're articulating, which is that gap between our current state of affairs and our desired state of affairs, is a drop in engagement. And you could also say the drop in performance by association too. Now, the next thing is that let's imagine that there was a question that was posed here with respect to the problem. To better understand the problem, and specifically the outcome here that we're interested in, which is engagement levels and then ultimately job performance, is we're trying to understand the antecedents that might lead to engagement. And maybe we ask a question based on the data, or that can be answered using the data, which is higher supervisor support associated with higher engagement? And then subsequent data analyses revealed, as I mentioned previously, that let's say that units with higher perceived supervisor support had higher engagement and higher performance. So then we get a yes answer to that question, that supervisor support is associated with engagement, and positively so. So that gives us now a mechanism or an opportunity to make change via supervisor support and to ultimately impact and improve those engagement levels. And so this leads us to a solution here, which is specifically to figure out how to create a training program that is going to improve perceptions of supervisor support by training supervisors on instrumental and emotional support and how to do so virtually. And this leads to that call to action that I've mentioned previously. So again, this is how you can layer on that problem-solving perspective and question formulation perspective onto this mountain structure storytelling, this mountain structure storytelling arc that we've articulated here. So now let's move on to the different components of a story. So I've already mentioned these briefly, that we have the beginning, middle, and end, but let's talk about these in a little bit more detail now. So again, the components of a structure, of a story structure at the most basic level is that a story will have a beginning, a middle, and an end. So in the beginning, as I've mentioned before, this is where we're really focusing on introducing the plot. So providing that background information. This is also, as part of that process, we describe the current state of affairs. If we're talking about an organization, we couch it within the context of that organization and anything external to the organization that might be important for the audience to know as it relates to the plot and to ultimately the problem we're trying to solve. You want to provide context here, and you want to show or tell the audience why they should care. And so there's different ways of doing this, but providing some kind of eye-catching or provocative or shocking information that you can introduce in the beginning can be a good way of drawing people's attention in and showing or telling them why they should care about the story that you're about to tell or in the process of telling. Sometimes this can be as simple as just providing people with shocking statistics. People might not realize, for instance, how much or how low the engagement levels had gotten, for example, or how high they had been previously, or even citing academic literature, how important engagement is for outcomes like job performance. Now, when we get to the middle part of the story, or the middle component of a story, as I mentioned before, this is really where we describe our desired state of affairs, or in other words, what could be, okay? So we have our current state of affairs, but what could be optimistically, or even if you think more pessimistically as well? What are we trying to avoid, or are we trying to attain here? Now, this is where it's helpful to provide illustrative or examples that can help illustrate what it is that you're trying to describe in terms of this ideal or desired state of affairs, or what could be. And this is where you articulate the problem in need of a solution, and or those questions that you formulate that are in need of answers. Now, ultimately, we arrive at the end component of a story. And this is, again, as I've mentioned before, where we offer those solutions to the problem and answers to our questions. We reach some kind of resolution or release here, and we have some type of call to action that we want our audience to be aware of, and as that implies, to actually go and do something. Or not just do something if we think about that behavioral, but maybe perhaps to think or feel about something in a different way. Now, this is also where we provide hopefully some takeaway message, and do so in a very clearly articulated way so people can remember that, they can commit it to their long-term memory. And this is also where we should very clearly articulate what those next steps are for people who are in that audience, and what they should do, or what steps or actions they should take. So where do we begin in the storytelling structure? So we'll start now by focusing again on that mountain structure that we've been using as an example, and then we'll focus on different places you can begin within that story. And there's many different ways you can think about this. I'll focus on two. I'll focus on first going chronologically, and then second thinking about starting with the ending first. So again, here we have that mountain structure to storytelling here. Now, if we go chronologically, it is as follows. We do as I've already described here, which was first we describe the plot and the rising action. We get to the climax, there's the falling action, and we get to the ending, the call to action, the resolution or the release of the tension in that story. Now, again, this would mean that we could just, in a very linear way, chronological way, I should say, we focus on first, what is the current state of affairs? What's then the desired state of affairs? In other words, what's the gap or the problem that needs to be solved here? And then we move on to the solution and ultimately the call of action at the end of the story. Now, another way we can focus on where to begin is actually starting with the ending first. And so here we start with the ending, and then we jump back to the plot to provide some context and information about the current state of affairs. And then ultimately we end up at that climax, or the pinnacle of the tension that we've built. So thinking about this in terms of that problem-solving perspective again, we're really starting with the call to action here. We're telling people up front, here's what we want you to do based on what we're about to tell you. Then we jump back and we contextualize it. So we start with that plot, describe where things started, what was the current state of affairs, and then we build to that desired state of affairs, increase that tension to the climax there, and ultimately articulate the problem. And then you'd probably reiterate that call to action once more at the end, just to make sure people walk away with that, committed to their long-term memory. So now let's focus on the audience and the context in terms of who are we telling the story to, as well as what are we using to tell the story. So let's think about the who, the what, and the how. So in terms of the who is the intended audience here? What is your relationship to the audience? This is a really important thing to consider before you start telling the story. So who is it that you want this story to be told to? And what is your relationship to those people that you're telling the story to? This can affect the tone and so forth, and how you talk to people and the types of language you use in terms of what your relationship is to them prior. So you're probably going to talk to a group differently if you've never met them before or have no relationship with them than if they're your team members, they're people that you work with day in, day out, and you have those established relationships and understandings with each other. So generally, and this is as Cole Knaflic recommends, you really want to focus your attention on as narrow as an audience as it makes sense. So instead of focusing on a very broad audience, as much as you can, try to focus what is the narrowest possible lens you can take in terms of focusing onto the audience. And so you really want to focus on who are the decision makers, who are the stakeholders, who's going to be in attendance, whether that's virtually, whether that's reading it asynchronously if this is in writing, or someone who's there in person. And trying to give as specific story as possible with that narrow audience in mind. Okay, so we really want to aim here at this narrow audience as much as possible. Now, that's not always going to be possible. Sometimes we're going to walk into a situation where the whole audience is going to be the entire organization. But even still, there's things we know about the organization that can really narrow how we think about it. We know the people, we know the structure of this organization. We can use that information as opposed to just giving a generic story that takes into account nothing about the organization. Another thing that's helpful, and I've seen some organizations do this, and I think this is a very creative solution, is to actually practice this in terms of practicing telling the same general story to different people or different groups of people. And so I've seen this actually manifested as actual like playing cards that you can hand out to people so they can practice storytelling. And so you give some kind of fictitious name, for example. There's maybe a silhouette or a generic stock photo of someone. You give their role. So let's say Doe J, so John Doe or Jane Doe here is the name of the person, this generic person. They're a benefits specialist and they work within the human resources department. And then you can have different dimensions in terms of things that might be related to the story, in terms of how well people will be able to understand or act upon the story, depending on their levels of these things. And so in this fictitious example, let's say you're looking at people's competence in their human resources knowledge and skills, their business acumen, their data literacy, technology, law, and ethics. And across these different competencies or dimensions, you can actually come up with, well, we think that people with this in this role in this department tend to be maybe really high in their knowledge and skills and their competence related to human resources, a little bit lower on business acumen, even lower on data literacy, not a little bit higher on technology, but in an absolute sense, not very high. And then the next highest, aside from HR in terms of competence, would be perhaps law and ethics. And this is completely fictitious, and this would, of course, vary by role, organization, and so forth, and department in terms of how you would fill this out. But the point is that you can use this information to say, well, how would we tell our story here to someone that has a really high competence in HR, but maybe low data literacy, especially if our story involves using data visualizations, bar charts, graphical displays, and things like that are based on data, and maybe talking about different types of analyses. How can we tell the story in a way that people will understand, be receptive, and be able to ultimately understand that call to action and act upon it? So next, we think about the what. So we've talked about the who of the audience in the context, but now let's talk about the what. And this is where you ask yourself questions like this. What do you want your audience to know, believe, or do? This is your call to action. You want to make sure you carefully and thoughtfully articulate this. You also want to ask, how will you communicate with your audience? So what methods or approach or tools are you going to use? And ultimately, what tone will your communication set? So are you trying to make people hopeful? Are you trying to make them excited? Are you trying to instill concern? What is it that you want to set with your communication in terms of the tone? So there's different ways in terms of the actual method or way or mode of presentation in terms of the story. We can do, of course, a live presentation, which is the very conventional and like perhaps one of the oldest forms of storytelling, is doing so in person and with a live audience. And so this is by nature going to be synchronous. So that's on one end of the continuum. It's doing a completely live synchronous presentation to a live audience. Now, this could also be live and synchronous to a virtual audience as well. And then on the other end of the continuum, as you can see here, we have actually doing so in written form. Maybe it's a written document that we've created, a technical report, a white paper, or maybe it's just an email with information that's telling a specific story. This is by nature going to be asynchronous. So you've created this, you've told the story, and now people can read about this story and read the details whenever they choose to do so or whenever they're told to read about those details. So that's going to be a little bit different in terms of how much information you need to provide in writing. When you have a written document, essentially these documents need to be standalone for the most part. Whereas a live presentation, you do have that opportunity where you can actually err on maybe a little bit less information with the assumption that people can ask questions in real time or at the end of the story to clarify or to understand what you've told them in better. Now, you can also be somewhere in between here too, where perhaps as part of the story, it's not told solely within one of these realms. Maybe people come having read part of maybe the plot of the story, so to speak, in a written document, and then they come to a live presentation to learn more about what the desired state of affairs is and what the call to action and the solutions are to the problem that's been articulated. Okay? And as much as you can, you want to try to fit it into one of these areas here in terms of focusing on either a synchronous presentation or asynchronous. What does happen quite a bit, and this is what Cole Knaflic refers to as a slidegement, is that often PowerPoint slides or Google slides are used in a way where they can be both standalone, so people could read them, and they could be something that's presented. Now, this doesn't typically work well for audiences in an absolute sense, and that's because, well, if you use slides to be standalone so people could read them, that means there's going to be a lot of text on them typically, which means that when they're actually presented to a live audience, it's going to be a lot for people to see visually as they're presumably hearing someone talk about the different topics that are presented on the slides. Alternatively, if you don't have enough writing in the slides and they're treated as a so-called slidegement, you're going to end up with something that is very vague or could be too ambiguous if only used as a written document. So that's really important to consider, is as much as possible, try to focus on one mode of presentation. And if necessary, you might actually need to create different types of, use different modes of communication with different ways of presenting a story based on the different ways you plan to deliver it or what it is that you're trying to deliver and how to do it. Now, ultimately, we ask ourselves this question in terms of the audience and context is how. And so if you're using storytelling that's focused around data, for example, as Brene Brown was alluding to, or not alluding to, but specifically stating in that opening quote to this lecture today, we want to focus on, well, what data, evidence, or information are available to support our points or your points, okay, that you're trying to make through your story. And this can make for a more compelling story if we're actually articulating what evidence we have for the problem we're trying to solve, the questions we're trying to answer, and so forth. If we're trying to, again, ultimately inspire that positive change in our organization, as would be consistent with the strategic storytelling approach that I mentioned earlier. So now let's talk about the importance of clarity and parsimony in the context of telling a story. So when we talk about clarity and parsimony, first let's start with clarity. This is really focusing on the fact that story clarity helps audience members take away the intended messages, ideas, or points. In other words, that they take away the steps that are necessary to adhere to that call to action that you make within your story. And so we don't want people to get lost in too many details or too many ideas or messages or points within our story if it's really just that we want them to take away just one to a few different things that we want them to actually act on. So clarity is really important here. And there's different ways we can structure the story and using repetition and things like that to assist with clarity. Now, generally, it's a good idea to identify about 1 to 3 points that you would really like for the audience to remember or to act upon, okay? And so this can not only help with clarity, but this can also help with that idea of telling a more simple or parsimonious story. So telling a parsimonious story with the deliberate and thoughtful repetition can actually facilitate this process. So if we have those 1 to 3 points, in other words, we can actually use repetition and be very deliberate with it in order to help facilitate this idea that people walk away remembering and having committed to their long-term memory these 1 to 3 points that relate to our call to action that we want them to go and then do or think about or feel about. Okay, so in general, where possible when you're telling a story, choose parsimony over complexity. So we don't want a story that's so complex and convoluted that it's hard for people to follow in real time, and even harder for them to remember or understand what it is they were supposed to take away from this story. We also want to focus on brevity over verbosity. So we don't want to be overly wordy in our story, but as I'll talk about next with this example of using repetition, it is good to use repetition, but we just don't want to be overly verbose about it, and we don't want to use too much repetition. But if you use it strategically and thoughtfully and carefully, it can really be a good storytelling tool. And of course, we don't want to go all the way to the other extreme of making it too brief where we don't provide enough information, but you really do want, where possible and where you can cut information, focus on how you can cut information from the story that doesn't add to the story and might even cloud the messaging of the story, and instead focus on brevity. So now let's talk about how we can use repetition to help with clarity of a story. Okay? And in some ways, this can actually make the story more parsimonious as well, as I mentioned before, because it helps people understand what it is they're supposed to take away from this story. So here's an example here. So we'll talk about red triangle, blue circle, and green square here. And so let's imagine this is a written document. So how could you use repetition here? Well, let's imagine that red triangle, blue circle, and green square are three different points or three different takeaways that we want people to leave the story with that relate to our call to action. Well, in our introduction to this written document, or within this written story, for example, we might just clearly articulate, here are the three things we want you to take away from this story. That is point 1, which is red triangle, point 2, which is blue circle, and point 3, which is green square. And then in the body of our document, we can then focus on fleshing out or articulating in more detail, well, what do we mean by green triangle, blue circle, green square here? And this is where we integrate that storytelling process and the tension related to these if you're doing this in a written form, for example. And then ultimately in the closing part of this document, for example, this is where we focus on repetition once more. And this is where we articulate and remind the audience or the reader, if this is a written document, that again, our take-home points here are red triangle, blue circle, and green square. These are the things we want you to remember when it comes to our call to action here. Okay, another thing that's helpful when we're thinking about clarity and parsimony as important tools for storytelling, or at least things to consider when telling a story, is that to achieve clarity and parsimony, we want to stay focused on the focal problem or question at the heart of the story we're trying to tell, okay? And so, in other words, that it means to use the story to provide a solution to the problem or an answer to the question. And this helps put on blinders or helps really focus us so that we don't start providing way too much information that's maybe tangential to the focal points we're trying to make, or the solutions to the problem or the answers to the question, by carefully and thoughtfully using the problem and the question that we set out to either solve or answer. This will help us tell a more clear story and hopefully a more parsimonious story as well, as everything we tell should relate back to helping explain the problem and explaining and articulating the solutions to the problem, and or explaining the question and articulating the different answers to the question. Now, at the end of storytelling, it is sometimes helpful to remind the audience of the focal question or problem, and then to tie the key takeaway points as part of the call to action back to the problem or question. And so this means just really articulating, again, here was the problem we set out to solve, and here was the related question. And then at the very ending of this story, articulate those things or repeat those things again, as this can help the people commit this to their long-term memory and walk away knowing what it is they're supposed to do based on that story you've told. Okay, so let's wrap up this lecture now by talking about some final considerations when it comes to telling a good, effective story. So first, choose a topic you care about. And I will say that I've adapted, and this has been inspired by Cole Knaflick and some of her suggestions from her 2015 book called Storytelling with Data. And it's important to choose a topic you care about. And so why is that? Well, this really is apparent often when you see someone telling a story, you hear someone telling a story, or you read about a story, whether or not the person who created that story and is telling that story actually seems to have a vested interest in that story and its outcome, as well as the call to action. So really focus on a story that you find compelling, interesting, and that will really hopefully set the tone for the audience and also be more apparent to the audience why they should care. Also, don't bore other people, and specifically the audience, about this topic. So even if it's something you care about, make sure you don't bore them and take their perspective. This is where perspective taking and empathy comes into play. Imagine what it's like to be someone that's not yourself, that hasn't spent so much time invested in crafting and developing this story. What is it that they really need to know? And not overwhelm them with details or tedious information that maybe isn't relevant or needed for them to act on that call to action at the end. Also, as I've mentioned before, again, focus on parsimony and clarity, of course, in your storytelling. And don't be afraid to reduce the complexity or length. And again, this gets that idea of brevity over verbosity when it comes to storytelling. And use your own voice. Storytell in a way that uses your own voice. And this especially relates to humor as well. So if you're not someone that would typically tell a joke and you already have relationships with these people in the audience, then it might seem a little unnatural to then start crafting very deliberate jokes and so forth in the context of this story. Also, be sure to communicate what you intend to communicate in the story. And so this is where focusing on the problem that needs to be solved and the question that needs an answer can be really, really useful because it reminds you as the storyteller, what is it that you need to communicate about? And again, if you have 1 to 3 points that you're trying to articulate and have people walk away and remember from your story as part of that call to action, make sure that you have that at the top of your mind when you're telling that story and as part of that communication process. And again, make sure that you empathize with your audience. This means both in terms of the length of the story, the complexity of the story, what their knowledge is coming into the story, their expertise, skill level, and so forth. And again, don't bore them if possible. And then finally, I've mentioned this before when it comes to using your own voice, but be thoughtful about the use of humor. Anytime you use humor, it can actually put you at risk, especially if you don't have a strong relationship with that audience, you don't know what things they'll find funny, or if you're using something that might be funny in some circles, maybe in some disciplines, maybe within HR, this would be a compelling joke or a funny joke, whereas in other areas of the business, finance, auditing, they just don't have the context to appreciate it. This can really fall flat and may actually detract from the story. So these are some final considerations to think about when it comes to telling and crafting your story. So just to briefly review what we talked about today, we started with that overview of what a story is, what storytelling in it is, and specifically what strategic storytelling is and what it's all about. And then we talked about different storytelling structures. We talked about the linear structure, Freytag structure, as well as the mountain structure. And then we thought about where can we begin within that structure? Do we tell a story chronologically or do we start with the ending first? And then we talked about, well, what considerations do we need? What do we need to take into consideration when it comes to the audience and the context for our story, as well as the importance of clarity and parsimony. And we just finished up with some final considerations. So here are the references. And so throughout this presentation, I referenced the following sources here that you can see listed. And this wraps up the lecture on telling a story.